Are you familiar with the story of Moneyball? A man uses statistics and logic to win several baseball games. It's my favorite film.
Have you ever wondered how much of a creative license the Moneyball film took in order to tell the story of the 2002 Oakland A's? Well, I read the book, went through some of the real-life data, and I'm here to tell you that, yeah, they changed quite a lot of things. From oversimplifying the whole Moneyball and sabermetrics movement to completely misrepresenting the people involved and even omitting some of the most important players in the team, I'm here to talk to you about the real story behind the 2002 Oakland A's. One of the main critiques many baseball fans have towards the film, especially A's fans, is that the movie, and to some degree the book, portrays the Oakland A's as these massive underdogs when in reality, they were a pretty good baseball team. Prior to the 2002 season, they had made the playoffs 2 years in a row, only to lose both times against the New York Yankees. People back then knew that the A's were, in every single possible way, the cheapest organization in baseball, but they also knew to expect the unexpected from them. For the 2002 season, however, expectations were particularly low after the A's lost 3 of their best players, Jason Isringhausen, Johnny Damon, and Jason Giambi. In the movie, you get the impression that losing these 3 players was an absolutely devastating blow to the A's, when in reality it was just another Tuesday for Billy Beane and Paul de Podesta, Peter Brand in the film. According to the book, Jason Isringhausen's departure wasn't a loss to the Oakland A's, but a happy consequence of a money machine known as selling the closer. Early in his career, Billy came to the conclusion that it was more efficient to create a closer than to buy one, and that closers were systematically overpriced thanks to the statistic by which closers were judged: saves. The term save is kinda meaningless. It was used by managers in the 1950s without any specific parameters. It simply referred to a situation where the pitcher entered the game with a lead of at least 3 runs and finished with a win. Billy came to the realization that he could simply take an above-average pitcher, drop him into the closer's role, let him accumulate some saves in a bunch of low-risk situations, and then trade him away the moment he began asking for more money. In return for losing Isringhausen to the St. Louis Cardinals, the A's had received 2 new assets: the Cardinals' first-round pick along with a first-round compensation pick. Not bad for a pitcher who Billy got out of the minors just 3 seasons prior. Replacing Johnny Damon, however, wasn't as easy since he left 2 holes behind, one in offense and the other one in defense. Replacing Johnny in offense was easy, they only needed to find a player with an on-base percentage of 324. Replacing Johnny on defense, though, was a whole other story since they didn't have a precise way to measure Johnny's defensive contributions. To address this, Paul had to analyze data from the last 10 years to determine the average outcome of similar hits. This allowed him to calculate the value of each individual defensive play. For example, he could tell that out of 8,642 identical hits with a specific trajectory and speed to a particular point on the field, 92% had resulted in a double, 4% in a single, and 4 in outs. By comparing the outcome of the balls directed at Johnny in center field to the average outcome of those balls, Paul was able to determine that he saved the team about 15 runs during the entire season. Now, while 15 runs is not a trivial number, it didn't justify the $8 million he was asking for, so they were more than happy to let him sign with the Boston Red Sox for $32 million. Now, replacing Jason Giambi on offense was impossible because he had an elite 477 on-base percentage, the highest in the American League by 50 points. Billy knew that while he couldn't replace Giambi, he could recreate him. So he and Paul went on a quest to find 3 players with an individual on-base percentage of 364 to fill the holes left behind by Giambi, Damon, and designated hero Olmedo Sainz. And just like in the movie, the 3 players selected were David Justice, Scott Hatteberg, and Jason's little brother Jeremy. Now, just a quick side note, all these scenes where Billy's fighting his scouts and coach Art Howe never happened. By 2002, the A's had been using sabermetrics for at least a decade, and while scouts never fully understood what Billy was trying to do, in part because every time he tried to explain it to them, they ended up getting more confused, they trusted Billy to call the shots. The movie changes the personalities of many of the people involved for narrative purposes, but Art Howe is the one that gets done the dirtiest. In the movie, he's portrayed as this whiny, passive-aggressive man who's always antagonizing Billy, while in the book he's basically a puppet that does everything the front office tells him to. In reality, Art Howe was generally on board and receptive to everything Billy Beane was trying to do and tried to be a team player. Now, if you watch the movie, you get the impression that these players selected by Billy were the backbone of that A's team. However, this isn't true. In fact, the movie, and to some degree the book, completely erases some of the most important players of that historic team. For starters, the A's had a pretty strong pitcher rotation featuring names like Tim Hudson, Mark Mulder, Billy Koch, Chad Bradford, and Barry Zito. If we take a look at the pitcher's winnable replacement, a stat that measures a player's total value to their team, calculating how many more wins they have contributed compared to a replacement level player, we'll find that the three aforementioned players are right on top of the list. The A's also had a lot of talent at bat in the form of Eric Chavez and 2002 MVP Miguel Tejada. There is simply no way you can explain the 20-game streak without these players, so why none of them made it into the film? Well, many people don't know this, but Moneyball's author Michael Lewis spent the entire 2002 season inside the Oakland A's building. He was there during the draft, preseason, and in Billy Beane's office watching him have an absolute meltdown as he saw his team lose an 11-run lead in that 20th game. However, the main focus of the book was to talk about the sabermetrics movement taking place inside the A's organization, not to document the historic winning streak. In fact, the way Lewis talks about the streak, it's almost anecdotal. He just casually mentions that the team suddenly began winning a lot of games, only focusing in that dramatic 20th game. As a result, while reading the book, you get the impression that Lewis develops a certain preference for those players that fit the whole Moneyball narrative. This is why relief pitcher Sam Bradford gets mentioned way more than any of the pitchers, even though Barry Zito was also a great example of an undervalued player. It's also the reason why Tejada and Chavez are not featured as prominently, since Billy and Paul felt they went against a philosophy that predated both of them. The movie portrays Billy and Peter Brand, Paul the Podesta, as the pioneers of the sabermetrics movement within the Oakland A's organization, which is not true. Billy actually inherited the movement from a man named Sandy Alderson, a former Marine Corps officer turned GM. According to Harvey Dorfman, the A's team psychologist at the time, Sandy didn't know shit about baseball, but he was a progressive thinker, and he wanted to understand how the game worked. Alderson concluded that everything from on-field statistics to player evaluation was better conducted as a scientific investigation of historical statistical baseball data rather than traditional baseball wisdom. At some point, Alderson commissioned Eric Walker, an aerospace engineer turned data analyst, to find the most efficient way to spend money on players. Walker discovered that while good pitchers were usually properly valued, good hitters were often undervalued, partly due to teams' overemphasis on batting average. Using a simple correlation metrics, Walker showed to Alderson that stats like on-base percentage and slugging had a higher correlation with a team's ability to score runs. Armed with this knowledge, Alderson implemented a uniform approach to hitting throughout the organization. People often think that this approach is all about taking pitches and hoping for a walk, but that's not it at all. It's actually about having plate discipline and only batting at pitches you could actually hit, something that both Chavez and Tejada were particularly bad at. At some point in the book, Paul shows Lewis the percentage of pitches outside the strike zone that each player swung at. A quick glance at the list makes it pretty obvious which players had the plate discipline the A's were trying to institutionalize and those who didn't. Chavez led the team in strikeouts with 119, with Tejada in 4th place with 84. Both also led the team in stolen bases, something that was heavily discouraged with 8 and 7. You can even see this lack of discipline taking a toll on both players' on-base percentage compared to disciplined players such as Hattiburg, Justice, and Giambi, which had a slightly better OBP than Tejada and Chavez, of about 30. What this meant is that system players reached base 2.2% more than the undisciplined ones. You might think that this is a trivial amount, however a 22-point difference in OBP can translate to around 10 to 15 more times reaching base per season, which can be huge. Now, does this mean they were holding back the team? Well, no, it was actually quite the opposite. They led the team in runs scored, accounting for 195 of the team's 800 runs that year. They also led the team in hits and runs batted. And while 119 strikeouts may seem like a lot, you have to take into consideration that Chavez had 653 plate appearances, resulting in a strikeout rate of around 18%, which is not particularly high for a power hitter like Chavez. You could even argue that they needed to swing at all those pitches in order to be productive. Now, does this mean Moneyball is a bunch of BS? Well, no. The Oakland A's relied on sabermetrics because they couldn't afford to build a team around star players like Chavez and Tejada, so they needed to find undervalued and cheap alternatives that could still get the job done. That's where Hattiburg, Justice, and Jeremy Giambi came in. Billy also played a huge role in the team's success. Another well-known fact about the A's was that they were kind of late bloomers that got significantly better after the trade deadline in July. This was because Billy knew that losing teams gave up hope by this point in the season, allowing him to get those players that they were reluctant to trade at the beginning of the season. This is how, just like in the movie, Billy was able to get Ricardo Rincon through a somewhat convoluted trade. And sometimes Billy would just flat out get lucky. When Billy decided to trade Jeremy Giambi away because he was frustrated with the team's losing record and felt that Jeremy was having a bit too much fun despite the team not making the postseason, Paul had to step in and tell Billy that he was being irrational. After all, Jeremy had a pretty solid OBP. Billy even admitted this was the worst baseball decision he had ever made, but it was the best decision he had made as a GM. Billy was so fed up with Jeremy that he agreed to trade him to the Phillies in exchange of John Mabry, a guy he hardly knew. Well, turns out Mabry became a crucial part of the team in that second half of the season. He proceeded to swat home runs and game-winning hits at a rate he had never before swatted them in his entire professional career, proving that just like the movie says, there is an element of luck to all of this. The reality is that sabermetrics will only get you so far. It's the reason why no low-budget team running purely on sabermetrics has won the World Series. The Moneyball system only worked because the A's knew more than the rest of the teams. Once bigger teams caught up and began incorporating similar strategies, the advantage was gone. In fact, 2 economic professors ran a study and found out that the A's lost all competitive advantage within a year after the publication of the book. The worst part is that the Moneyball phenomenon may have contributed to the A's decline in recent years. It enabled the owners to keep investing the bare minimum on the team, making the A's players some of the lowest paid in the league, as well as having a completely obsolete and dysfunctional stadium. These factors led to the team getting relocated to Las Vegas by 2028, with this season being the first one they will play outside the Coliseum after 57 years. Another tragic aspect of the Moneyball movement is that in some ways Billy Beane became what he sought to destroy. One key difference between the book and the movie is that the film downplays how much of a failure Billy's career in the big leagues actually was. If you watch the film, you get the impression that Billy was just some random high school kid who was lucky enough to get drafted by a big market team, but this couldn't be further from the truth. This is how the book describes a young Billy Beane. When he was a young man, Billy Beane could beat anyone at anything. He was so naturally superior to whomever he happened to play against in whatever sport they happened to be playing that he appeared to be in a different, easier game. Standing at 6'4" as a high schooler, he was the poster boy of what recruiters were looking in a future big league star. He could run, he could throw, he could catch, he could hit with power, and perhaps more importantly, he had what recruiters call a good face. He just looked good in a uniform. He looked so good that the Mets were willing to take him with the first overall pick of the 1980 draft. The only reason why they were hesitant was because he was planning to attend Stanford on a baseball scholarship where he would also serve as their new quarterback after one John Elway left in order to play for the Denver Broncos. After joining the Mets, Billy spent the following years bouncing through different teams within the multiple levels of professional baseball without ever living to his true potential, something that baffled every coach and teammate he played with. Not even he knew why he was never able to become a major league player. Everything changed when he began working under Sandy Alderson, who introduced him to Bill James' revolutionary work, which completely blew his mind. He realized this new school of thought could be used to remove the mystical element about baseball he was never able to get his head around. From that point on, Billy waged a crusade against the medieval scouting way of thinking that had misjudged him all those years ago. Ironically, he began to rely blindly on statistics, falling into the same traps old school scouts fell. Try saying that fast 3 times. Old school scout, old school scouts, old school scouts. A prime example of this is Jeremy Brown, a University of Alabama catcher who caught Billy's eyes with his impressive 493 on-base percentage. Billy ended up drafting Jeremy with the 35th pick overall, convinced that one day he would become a great player for the A's. However, by the time Jeremy Brown retired in 2006, he was only able to play for the A's for about a month. As Alan Hirsch, author of The Beauty of Short Hops, noted, Brown is not just one player whom one general manager misvalued. In fact, Beane didn't evaluate him at all. He thought Brown's college statistics were all he needed to know. Brown and Brent Colamarino, another player being created based on statistics despite his known athleticism, are pretty good examples of one way in which statistics can be overvalued, in this case at the expense of old-fashioned scouting. In the same way scouts drafted Billy because he checked a bunch of arbitrary boxes, Billy drafted Jeremy because he had the right stats: 390 at-bats, 98 walks, 38 Ks, and 21 home runs. In contrast, Billy's first pick of that draft, Nick Swisher, who was widely recognized as a top prospect by scouts, went on to win a World Series with the Yankees. It is also worth noting that some of those picks that Billy made on that draft were also very successful, but that's a story for another day. So, what's the takeaway from all of this? Well, for me is that there is a limit to how much we can reduce sports to numbers and data. We've seen what this data-driven optimization has done to sports. We've seen it in basketball where everyone pulls up from the three-point line feeling like Stephen Curry only for this to happen. We've seen it in football where Guardiola has sucked the creativity out of some of the best players in the world, and leagues have been noticing this too.
I'm fascinated by what I'm going to call the end of the Moneyball era. It's the era of analytics. So in baseball, we're already seeing this, right? We're seeing pitching timers and pitching clocks and bigger bases and fewer defensive shifts. Essentially, we're creating human rules to push back against the mathematical machine. They're now talking inside the commissioner's office about the fact that there are too many threes, too much homogeneity in offensive strategies. Math fixed sports in a very specific way, because especially with baseball and basketball, the ratings are down. They're losing out to a sport in football that's too complex to be optimized.
There is this episode of The Simpsons called Moneyball, a parody from Moneyball, that I think sums all of this up pretty well. In the episode, Lisa becomes obsessed with sabermetrics, completely ruining the game for Bart, who can no longer do all the fun stuff like stealing bases. At the end of the episode, Lisa gives the following speech to Bart after he tries and miserably fails to steal home in the last play of the game.
You made me love baseball, not as a collection of numbers, but as an unpredictable, passionate game.
I know this might be a romantic approach to sports in general, but as the man himself said it,
how can you not be romantic about baseball?
As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.